It's one of Valmo's nightclubs. We have it surrounded.
Okay, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of Porkins Policy Radio. As always, I'm your host, Pierce Redmond, and you can find this podcast and all the other podcasts by going to porkinspolicyreview.wordpress.com. Well, today we have an extremely important guest and someone who I have admired and looked up to for quite some time now, and that is the one and only Sibel Edmonds. And for anybody that doesn't know, Sibel is the editor of BoilingFrogsPost.com. She is a former FBI whistleblower and is one of the few people in the history of the United States to have the state secrets privilege enacted against her for what she exposed and what she tried to tell the public. She is fluent in over 4 languages. She is the founder and director of the National Security Whistleblowers Coalition, and she is also the author of 2 excellent books, which everyone should go out and buy. The first one being Classified Woman, the Sibel Edmonds Story, which chronicles her time at the FBI and her subsequent gagging by the government. And her latest book is a novel, and that is The Lone Gladio. And I've asked Sibel to come on the show to discuss this new novel and all of the geopolitical implications of it and everything else in between. So, Sibel, thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thank you for having me on your show.
Excellent. So before we get started, I'm pretty positive that all of my listeners are pretty well versed in your life and what you've been doing. But if you want to give everyone just a quick kind of thumbnail sketch of what you do and what happened to you at the FBI, and then we'll get right into the book.
Well, that's a tough question to do a summary. Something I'm not really used to, but I came to the United States in 1988. I lived in Turkey and Iran before that. And I went to the universities here, got my bachelor degrees in criminal psychology and criminal justice, and my master's degree on public policy. I speak 4 languages, as you just mentioned. And I worked briefly for the FBI right after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. and while I was with the FBI, I became aware of some very serious cover-ups and issues. And I didn't go out and blew the whistle publicly initially. It was all internal, all the way through the director of the FBI. And later the Congress and the Inspector General's office. And I became the most gagged woman in the history of the United States. The Attorney General twice invoked the state secrets privilege. This is an executive privilege in my case. And they basically gagged me and classified everything about me, including the languages I speak, the schools I attended, where I was born, etc. And that's basically the summary of my background. I don't want to get into the really details. So much information is available online, my website, Boiling Frogs Post, and also other sources within the big world of internet.
Yeah, and again, if anybody wants a clearer picture about this, I couldn't recommend Classified Woman enough. And it's just jam-packed with your entire story at the FBI. But anyway, let's get on to this new book that you have, The Lone Gladio. And anyone who has been following me on Twitter and on the podcast knows that I was lucky enough to get a review copy of the book. So I've now had a chance to read it twice and absorb it. And I'll say, I devoured it in about a day and a half when I first got the book. And I'm sure that from the title, everyone can kind of posit that this is referring to Operation Gladio. And again, I don't want to go too much into that, and I think that the original Gladio is fairly well known in the mainstream through some books and documentaries. There is the Italian parliamentary investigations, and it's even seeped into some of our pop culture, like in TV shows such as Archer, which had a whole episode revolving around Gladio. And you've through various interviews and whatnot, elaborated on Gladio Plan B. And this, of course, would be the shift from NATO funding these sort of right-wing fascist groups and implementing false flag attacks to blame on leftists. And this shifted in the early 1990s into funding Islamic extremists and using a whole different set of networks and whatnot to indoctrinate these people, to send them around, and to create this sort of strategy of tension. And this particularly sort of revolves around Central Asia, and this is a big part about your book. So again, if anybody is really interested in understanding Gladio Plan B, I would suggest that the listeners go, and I'll provide the links to your very lengthy series of interviews with James Corbett, where you go into a lot of detail about all of this. But again, I'm going to assume that everyone is somewhat familiar with Gladio. But I'm more interested in how and why you started writing this book, because I know that, for myself, when I first heard that you were writing a new book, I assumed that this would be another, nonfiction book. But I was actually pleasantly surprised that it was a novel, because it first off, it breaks, all of the rules and barriers of the typical spy thriller, and it really kind of just, engrosses you and sucks you in. So, Sibel, how did you start writing, or why did you start writing this?
Well, with my first book, Classified Woman, I went through almost 2 years of battle with the FBI and the Justice Department, because I held the highest level security clearance while I worked with the FBI. When you have clearance and when you work for these agencies, you're obligated for the rest of your life, even if you worked for them for, let's say, 5 days, okay? And let's say you got out, or you worked as a contractor for a brief period, let's say for 2-3 months, and you got out. You're obligated, they hook you like this, of course, with all the paperwork you sign before your employment, to submit any nonfiction book to them, whether it's the CIA, if you worked for the CIA, or the FBI or the Justice Department. And the agencies have 60 days to vet your work. They call it pre-publication review. So what they do is they hold this black marker in their hands. They go through every single line, and they try to black out anything that they deem to be classified or sensitive. And then they turn it back, return it to you, the manuscript. And at that point, you're allowed to go to the publishers, or in whatever way you want to publish the book, and turn that manuscript into a book. And so I did that because I was obligated. I could have gone to jail if I not done that. And even though I did not, later, after I blew the whistle at the FBI, I realized everything they do that totally is against our liberties. And so anyhow, and the Constitution, especially the First Amendment. So I submitted it to them, and 60 days, 90 days, 150 days later, we never heard back from the FBI or Justice Department, even though legally they are bound to do this in 60 business days. So I had to go and obtain legal services, attorneys, and they contacted the Justice Department and the FBI. And the FBI and the Justice Department said, everything in this book is classified, every single word. So instead of blacking out the line by line, we are telling you she cannot publish anything in this book. Anything. Well, if you've read Classified Woman, you know that it provides some background, my childhood, and most of it actually takes place after I left the FBI. I was kicked out of the FBI. So to say that every single word was classified in this manuscript, of course, was ludicrous. To make the long story short, we had this battle right and left and back and forth court with the Justice Department and the FBI, and after a year and a half, I said, I'm going to publish it. I don't care. It's what they are doing is against First Amendment. It's even against their own rules. There is nothing that says anybody can go and classify it in the United States, any government agency, the entire book, including the page number. I mean, that's ludicrous. So I published a book, and of course, I didn't put anything that was justifiably classified in that book. But I found out during the process that that if you write a fiction book, a novel, you don't have to submit it to any of these agencies. So that was when the idea came to me that I can actually tell a much better story, a much more sincere, free-flow story through a fiction than through a nonfiction. So that's when I started, as soon as I finished Classified Woman and published it, and it was self-published, I wrote and I began writing the novel, The Lone Gladio.
Mm. And again, the novel just flows. I mean, from the first page, you are just absolutely hooked and sucked in. And something, for anyone that's read any sort of spy thriller, be it the kind of, Tom Clancy or even things like Graham Greene, there is sort of a formulaic method to this, and many of the characters are these kind of, archetypal spy thriller characters. And what I loved so much in The Lone Gladio was that you took those. So you take the kind of clandestine operative. In this case, his name is Greg McPherson, OG 68, and he kind of goes rogue from the company, as he refers to it. And again, that's a trope that we've seen over and over again. But with Greg, I mean, he is just so different from any other spy thriller. And he really operates in this very gray area throughout the entire novel. And he, of course, later, and I don't want to give away too much, but he sort of forms an uneasy alliance with a character, Elsie Simon, who I'm sure everyone will know who that is. She is the elegant, sophisticated FBI translator who is of Turkish, Iranian, and Azerbaijani descent. And the two of them team up, and throughout the novel, there is this, amazing back and forth between the two of them, where they're discussing, well, is this right? Is this okay? And frequently, torture is used over and over again by Greg. And I just wonder if you would like to kind of just talk about that a little bit, and a little bit about Greg as a character, because again, he's so different from anything else that you see in a spy thriller.
Well, as you mentioned, when you look at many of the spy thriller books, especially the ones that involve CIA or FBI agents, but especially the ones involving the CIA, you always have a certain type of superhero, and you have these really clear divides between the parties involved, casted in the book. You have the good guys and you have the bad guys, and the ultimate ending or the message with many of these books have to do that, well, these are the heroes who are serving their government, their country. Even in cases where you have villains within the government, it is, in the end, it's the good guys in the government win against the bad guys. And basically that summarizes many of the plots that you see. And in the real world, really, it doesn't work that way. And especially, again, when you're dealing with agencies such as the CIA and also Black Ops. There's also and this is the case mostly with the, not mostly, always the case with the, Hollywood created movies. You have all these characters, these tough, heroic characters created. They may be a little bit eccentric, or they may be a little bit, maybe they have a little bit of grace, but they are clearly good guys. And their agencies, let's say the CIA, may have some really bad villains, but those are like the few bad apples, because mostly the agencies are good, because it's the main publishers, mainstream publishers, and Hollywood, that is one of their number one priorities and business. It's not only making money, because movies are financed in all sorts of ways. And in some cases, as you see, a lot of movies actually lose money, profit. But one of their priorities is to serve their masters, and that is to be the marketing tentacles, tools for the images that are cast and formed within people's mind, the viewers. So when people read these books and when they watch these movies, they formulate these notions or these notions and ideas of what these people do. Let's say people in the CIA, and what kind of guys and women they are. And all of it is just fictional fantasies. I mean, none of it really matches what really is the case with these types of agencies and black ops. It started even with movies and series like 007, James Bond. You're always looking at these hunky guys who are very good in screwing some really hot-looking babes, and the babes always change, but you have usually cast the same hunky guy for at least 3-4 parts of the movie theater, and they're sharp, they dress good, and these women, they're wearing all the Guccis, and it's like, think about it. When you look at the majority of the people, everybody wants to be that, and they actually, without realizing, they worship the notion, the ideas of, especially for the operatives, CIA agents who go around the world and this is to defend the United States and their people interests, their security, whether it's against the terrorists or the big bad communists or the horrifying Islamists, and man, they've got really great lives. They have hot lives, Look at the cars they drive and look at the babes they screw. Who wouldn't want to be that, right? So when you have that already formed as the impression, as the idea, notions in people's head of who these agents are, these operatives are, it's very easy for the government, let's say in the United States, to commit a lot of evil acts. And even when some scandals break or some leaks take place, people don't want to accept it, the facts, because these are done supposedly by these hot guys with hot babes with hot cars, and for the benefit and for the good of the people. And that has worked beautifully, and it's by design. We have had these leaks and the exposés on torture, horrifying stuff. We have had all these things with the black sites, all these sites created in Eastern Europe and elsewhere, where people, without their guilt being established, being taken there, tortured, waterboarded, killed, electrocuted, And when this facts surface, even though as a nation we have people, majority wanting to believe that we don't do things like that. Americans don't do. Look, in all the movies we have had, Hollywood movies, these things were done by those cold and steely KGB agents in Russia, or they were Hitler's guys in Germany, or these barbaric Islamic people in Saudi Arabia or Yemen who are beheading. But our people, Americans, they won't do things like that, right? But despite that, and with the facts surfacing about these issues, people still don't want to override that whole image notion indoctrinated to them, with all these movies and books put out there for half a century of who these agents are. They don't want to accept that these people are actually on the side of the evil and not the good. And what they are doing is totally against the interests of the American, the people, versus their interest. And so with that in mind, and knowing that, and having known many operatives throughout my organization's establishment, National Security Whistleblowers Coalition, and being familiar with many operations, I didn't want to write a book. That was not my objective. That followed the footsteps of the Hollywood and the mainstream publishers of what things are. Despite some little gray areas here and there, you're still always looking at the guys in white hat going against the guys in black hat. And people rooting for the guys in the white hat. So there that you won't find those ingredients in this book. I would never write it. Well, there are too many authors out there writing them. Good for them. They're making tons of money. But that was not the purpose. It was meant to be a very sincere, honest spy thriller, and realistic, and backed by history, context, facts, and not some I would call, let's say, fantasy woven by the mainstream, the tentacles of the deep state. So it is about the deep state, and it is meant to let people have some, at least the ones who have not been following the alternative media, while they're enjoying an action-packed spy thriller fiction, maybe, hopefully, to open their minds and maybe see things from a slightly different perspective, which actually is not really that much slightly. It's seeing it from the more realistic side versus the fantasy side.
Exactly. And constantly throughout the book, I found myself having like a love-hate relationship with all of the characters. You know, at times you're like, yeah, Greg is really, you know, he's doing this for, you know, the person he loves. And then, you know, he'll flippantly talk about how he's upset that he wasn't involved in some massive terror attack. You know, as if butchering thousands of people is something that one would be upset that they weren't in on. And the same, even Elsie will kind of go to some great lengths at times and do some semi-questionable things in order to kind of fight back against this system that has been created. But I'd like to just quickly shift to some of the geopolitics of this book, because that's obviously an integral part in the Lone Gladio. And again, unlike other spy thrillers where there is this sort of CIA wet dream where Iran is working with Al-Qaeda and, you know, Hezbollah in Russia or something like that, this is really based in reality, and the geopolitics of it are extremely relevant. And recently, me and Christoph Gehrman were talking on our new podcast about some of the stuff that was going on in Georgia lately, and we also touched a little bit on the Lone Gladio. But in the novel, you talk quite a bit about this concept of opening up Georgia and using this as a sort of launching ground, launching base for operations in places like Dagestan and Chechnya. And recently we've seen this NATO base popping up in Georgia. There's a possibility that they'll start training Syrian rebels there. And there was also a bombing in Grozny in Chechnya, which is pretty astounding, because it's Chechnya, for, you know, better or worse, has been quite kind of, you know, calm in the past couple of years. So Sibel, could you just elaborate a little bit on this? And because again, you know, the Lone Gladio takes place a few years ago. It's more or less around the area of 2003. But there are so many little bits and pieces geopolitically that seem to really be coming to fruition right now. So if you'd like to talk about that at all.
Sure, because these operations, Operation Gladio B, started in mid-1990s, around end of 1996, when the NATO, MI6, Pentagon, CIA, they switched their main modus operandi that they had in place, their operations that were in place for the original Gladio, and switched to the and you mentioned during the beginning of this podcast about funding. It was more than that. The company, and that this is how it's referred to in the book, they actually created these cells and then created, funded, and directed. And they are still doing exactly that same thing. So it's not only, let's say, some extremist cells, you know, major ones existing in these regions. And right now, I'll put aside Middle East, because I know everybody's talking about the so-called ISIL, but focus on the various Islamic cells that we hear their names here and there. Usually the names are so long, so it doesn't stick with people here in the West. or names like Jamaat and Al Nusra. It's like, if I can spell it, dude, I don't know that. I don't want to know about it. Okay, this is hard to know. I think that's why the new marketing branding tactic has shifted even from Al Qaeda to ISIL. Let's make it abbreviated. Let's insert the word Islam there, and that way it sticks better. Okay, so who are doing these things as far as the Western world is concerned? The people, they are the Islamists. They are the Muslim extremist people. And what's their name? ISIL. Or let's shorten it even further. Let's just refer to them as IS. So everybody knows IS. Okay, but when you start looking at some of these other long stretch names in these regions, these supposed Islamic cells, people usually can't even pronounce or even read the entire name altogether. So these cells were actually put together by the company. And this happened, within 5-6 years after the fall of the Soviet Union, and for a very thoroughly put together, based on a very thoroughly put together design. And that was, okay, so we want to contain Russia, and we want to dominate Russia, because even though the Soviet fell, we still consider them as, and still do, as competitors. Same thing with China. And so what we'll do is we look at all the former Soviet Union. Okay, so if you have a map there and you look at all these countries, Azerbaijan, and you're looking at Georgia, you're looking at Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and see strategically which ones we target and how do we do this. Well, even though these nations, not Georgia per se, but many of them were under the communism and the Soviet Union, their alphabets were switched and changed to the Russian, and their official language became Russian with their schoolings. Despite being in that position for half a century, they still maintain to a certain degree some of their own characteristic and heritage and culture and religion, and is predominantly Muslim. That was Islam was the religion, and their heritage is a Turkic heritage. They are Turks in terms of their roots, where they come from, and their languages were various dialects of Turkish. And so as we did, with Mujahideen in Afghanistan, in that case, we didn't only capitalize on some sophisticated resistance cell in Afghanistan during the 1980s war, Afghans' war against the Soviet Union, against Russia. It was actually, we put together the cell because many of these people, Mujahideens, and their commandos, their higher-ups, these freedom fighters, the so-called freedom fighters, were not Afghani people. They were not from Afghanistan. They were brought from countries like Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, and their leaders were actually trained in Western countries, either in UK or the United States, both militaristically, but also by the CIA, intelligence-wise. So it was not like going there and capitalizing on some sophisticated army resistance unit and say, okay, we'll back you and fund you against the Soviet Union. No, actually, we put together these cells and we put the head of these cells with, we positioned people that were our people, the CIA people, including Osama bin Laden. So the same thing here. We said, okay, and this is the Western, the company, we will capitalize on the language and the heritage, but mainly the religion, because more than anything else, they were, even during the whole Soviet Union Cold War era, when you look at many Middle Eastern countries, one of the reasons they didn't fall within the Soviet Union and communist camp was the religion. I can give you an example where I grew up, Iran. I mean, that we had the party, the leftist party, they call it the Communist Party, the Marxist Socialist Party, but 85-90% of the people, they wanted exactly the opposite side. They wanted to back the opposite side during the entire Cold War because of Islam, because they considered atheism and communism, okay, of a bigger enemy than the United States and the Western world, under, which they are recognized in these countries as the Christians. Okay, at least they believe in God, etc. So communists, if you look at relatively speaking, was a worst enemy for them, and that helped the United States, that helped the NATO, because you're looking at Turkey and Iran and Saudi Arabia. So they were saved from being forging alliance with the Soviet Union. So the same mechanism still was in place. Now with the Soviet Union gone, the company said, okay, let's revive that strong sense of heritage and nationalism, but more than that, the Islam, Muslim, the religion in these places. This is when, of course, U.S. doesn't do a lot of things straightforward. They would give, let's say, a country like Saudi Arabia or Qatar $1 billion and say, okay, reserve this much of it, and then you establish mosques in this region, okay? Erect about 45 mosques in Azerbaijan, okay, in and around Baku. Or go to these sections of Kyrgyzstan and start putting, erecting mosques and madrasas, the religious schools, and start the whole indoctrination process together with the propaganda of the enemy being, the Russians, but also forming these cells as the units that would carry out terrorist attacks. Anyhow, so that's how it all started in 1990s and continued. And the whole grand game remained the same, and modus operandi remained the same. And we expanded these cells, and as that started taking place, we started doing things like trying to say, okay, so now we also have Georgia. And we started closing in more and more towards the heart of the country, nation for Russia. I mean, if you look at the map and see where these cells are, let's say Chechens, by capitalizing on certain Chechen sects and factions and saying, okay, you come into our camp, we'll arm you, we'll train your commandos, we'll do everything, both intelligence-wise, but also militaristically, for you to carry out these attacks in Russia. And doing so was great, has been great for the United States, because when that happens, number one, it weakens Russia. When internally you're bogged down with terrorism, right, and this whole clashes with various sects, that weakens you within the international context. Number two, the other thing that happens is provoking Russia into response. Okay, so you get some maybe Chechens or some particular group from Kyrgyzstan carrying out an attack, which is ferocious and innocent people die, but amplify and expand upon Russia's reaction. And the harder Russia reacts, okay, against these, the more that gets publicized within the Western international communities as, Russians are doing this against their minority, et cetera, et cetera. But Georgia, I'm glad you brought it up and you mentioned, because that is going to be the next front. I mean, we have been seeing all the stuff with Ukraine. We had that very short, less than a week supposed war in Abkhazia. But the next wave is coming from Georgia, and it's going to involve the Chechens in the region, and it's going to be linked. And here is one of the things that I will put forth here, and it's hard to do because a lot of things, dynamics change because they have to modify the scenario. Certain things are going to come back again. They're going to be revived, especially this thing with Boston, so-called Boston bombing.
Yes,
that issue was never resolved. Of course, what happens? I mean, the guy is being interrogated by the FBI agent, and he dies. He gets shot several times, so we are going to see that whole case coming back again. And and that's where I will stop. Ask the next question.
Yeah. Oh, well, no, I mean, I think that's all great. And again, I mean, when you're reading the Lone Gladio, you're going to be struck at how relevant everything is, and you'll start to put pieces together. And I think it's just, for someone like myself who I consider that I know a lot of this information, and I went into the book thinking, I'm going to know everything, and then there were so many little nuggets where I was just blown away at how prescient your predictions were, especially vis-a-vis Georgia, where of course this is where we're seeing a massive amount of these so-called freedom fighters joining IS or ISI. A lot of them are coming from Georgia. And again, there was just a recent agreement between Russia and Abkhazia, this breakaway region, and Georgia is getting very upset about all of this. So again, really everyone just, when you're reading the book, there's so many levels. You can read it just for the characters. You can read it for the geopolitics. You can read it and try and guess, who is Yusuf Muhammad? Who is this guy? Who is that guy? But before we finish up, and I know you have to get going soon, I just thought I would ask you, how should we view Operation Gladio Plan B right now in today's environment? How should we be, talking about it? How should we be using the phrase? Because I know that in a lot of the alternative media, certain, phrases and memes will get tossed around, and sometimes they end up losing their meaning. And I know that, quite a few people have been sort of, commenting and trying to figure out exactly how we use this. So, Sibel, I mean, you're an expert on this. How should we go about talking about Gladio B, and how should we go about spreading the word?
Well, I'm definitely by no means an expert, but one of the things that I learned in a very, very early age through my father was in all the situations, and this is mainly geopolitical situations, specifically wars, you always step back from the situation and look at it and first try to determine who gains and who loses, okay? And this novel gets into that in addition to several other issues similar to that. And that is, whether it is the clashes in Syria, okay, or in Iraq, or even within Iraq, the clashes that takes place between various sects versus Shias versus Sunnis versus the Kurds. And if you step back and look, you actually can very clearly see that the losers are the people, no matter which sect they are from, whether they are Kurds or the Shia or Sunni, they're the population at large. They are the ones who are losers. And you say, well, who gains the biggest advantage out of this? And once you're able to look at it and determine who doesn't have to be a person, doesn't have to be one nation, it doesn't have to be one entity, then you start understanding the situation. And this is how people should look at Operation Gladio B, okay? And for example, when you're looking at what's going on, with the current made up ISIS, and look at it and say, okay, you really see the millions of immigrants now from Syria. They are in Jordan, they are in Turkey, okay, and you look at internally the people who are still there, they are all losing, okay. Same thing when you look at the neighboring countries, and then people are very quick to start saying, oh yeah, a lot of it is designed and done by countries like Saudi Arabia. Well, they may be very small stakeholders in this, but then you have to look at Saudi Arabia and say, who put in place this kingdom in Saudi Arabia? Who protects Saudi Arabia? Who maintains Saudi Arabia's military? Okay, you're looking at a lot of imbecile kings and princes, with a lot of inbreedings, etc. They're Mongols, and so they're not even capable of designing anything. And I'm not putting Saudis down here. I'm looking at the kingdom. You have about 791 prince, and you have about another 927 princesses, and they pee in some gold, 24-karat gold commode. This is what their lives involved, okay? You're not looking at these shrewd, policy-making, militaristic country government. But if the United States were to withdraw its support and sustaining of Saudi Arabia, not through all the billions of dollars military aid, but if you go within the military base in Saudi Arabia, you will see who's running it. They are not Saudis. You will not find a single Saudi in the highest level running the intelligence in Saudi Arabia or the military. So you look at, so it's not the kingdom. So advantages of who in Saudi Arabia, because as far as the population is concerned, over 97% of the Saudis in a day without the U.S. maintaining this kingdom would take over. It would be the biggest revolution and it won't take long, okay? But who sustains the military? So people say, oh yeah, Saudi Arabia went and opened this, and Saudi Arabia, and with the Sunni factor, they are doing this against Syria's Assad. That is absolutely wrong. Even though with the ideological, religious divides, Shia versus Sunnis, there may be some advantages there, but they are not the ultimate winners here. They are not the ones who are going to get the big advantage out of this bloodbath and what's going on there and what is actually being made to happen by the Western nations, who are, people who are training and arming these rebels, the real people. And then when you look at it and say, well, okay, when you say U.S., is Obama as a person or George Bush or Dick Cheney taking a huge amount of advantages? Well, even though these corrupt presidents, they become millionaires, by the time they leave the presidency and then they get paid off, that's not the big gain. But what happens when you look at billions, trillions of dollars? You basically come down to the military-industrial complex. I mean, look at the stock prices for the military-industrial complex-tied companies since this whole ISIL propaganda started. Wow, it went up. Look at Boeing's stock prices, okay? Look at SAIC's, stock prices. So you're looking at military-industrial complex. You look at the oil vultures, whether you're looking at BP or Exxon or Mobil. So you're looking at the oil industry, you're looking at the military-industrial complex, and you're also looking at the major global financial institutions. And even though they seem to be hundreds of them, when you get down to it, you're not going to be even making a dozen. You're looking at 4 or 5 that run everything. And they all have very big, large stakes on this. So to sustain these monstrous, big industries, all 3 of them, you need to have these terrorism. Synthetically, you create terror. Synthetically, you create wars. And with the propaganda, you represent them as something that they are not. And you make them some wars between Chechens and Russians because they're a minority and they want their rights. Or you make it against Sunnis and Shias, or you're making them against some, minorities, the Kurds against Sunnis, Saudi Arabia, Qatar versus Iraq. And it's not any of these. These are all just smoke and fog created intentionally. The real operation goes back to Operation Gladio, which's existence is a deep state. It's not a particular president or a vice president. It is to sustain and ensure not only survival but expansion of the military-industrial complex.
And again, you go into a lot of that in the book, and you describe that, the people in the government aren't even in charge of Gladio. These are, people outside the government. And Greg, for instance, doesn't even know who the top 10 people in Operation Gladio could possibly be. He has ideas. But again, there's so much more in the book. I mean, you go into blackmail, you go into the problem with the media, how complicit it is with all of this. You go into sex trafficking and so many other things. So, Sibel, I mean, we'll have to have you back on the show again at some point.
Certainly.
To hopefully
anytime.
Go into this. Oh, absolutely, anytime.
Anytime.
But briefly, where can they get the book? How can people help support you? Be it through BFP, be it through the book, anything like that.
Well, the website for the book is lonegladio.com. And on the website, all the channels where this book can be purchased are listed: Amazon, Kindle, Barnes & Noble's Nook. But people who don't want to do that, if they want to purchase it directly from me, that channel is also provided, also signed copies. So the Lone Gladio would be a good starting point. And as far as the current issues and what we are doing as an alternative media with our partners, Boiling Frogs Post is a good place to get the real overview of what is happening versus all the bombardments they are getting from the tentacles of the military-industrial complex and the financial institutions such as Washington Post or New York Times, and many, many pseudo alternative media channels. When you look at their funders, people who fund them, people who manage them, the reporters they get, you look at exactly the same people as the mainstream media. There is zero difference except they're nonprofit.
Yeah.
They are listed as 501c3. But so a lot of these places that pose under, under the guise of being alternative media, they are not. So they can get a better view of what's happening. And of course, your website and James Corbett's website.
Well, thank you so much, Sibel. And
thank you.
And again, please, everybody, go out and purchase the book, get a subscription to BFP. Thank you so much for joining us, and I hope we can talk again soon.
Most certainly. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, everybody, so that about does it for this episode of Porkins Policy Radio. If you enjoyed this podcast and you'd like to hear some more of my work, then please visit porkinspolicyreview.wordpress.com. There you can find all the links. You can download the episodes freely through the website, or you can view them on YouTube. And my YouTube channel, of course, is youtube.com/1138porkins. So please definitely subscribe to the YouTube channel. Follow me on Twitter at Porkins Policy. Also, you can follow through email blasts as well on the website, and also through the RSS feed. And, before I sign off, I just want to say again that everyone should really go out and get a copy of the Lone Gladio. It really is it's simply required reading for anybody growing up in the 9/11 generation, or anyone who is interested in how the war on terror and the deep state really functions. And I think you can read this book over and over again, and you'll get something different every single time. And of course, we didn't really get into too much of the plot, detail and summary and things like that. And there are so many characters and so many different locations and moving parts in this book that we could probably talk for hours and hours. So hopefully we'll have Sibel on again to go into some more detail about the book and about the work that she's been doing over at BFP. And lastly, I just want to say to give a big thanks to everybody who listened to me and Christoph Gehrman's first episode of our new podcast series, which is called Porkins Great Game. We got tremendously great feedback on the episode, lots of people viewing it, downloading it from the site, so that's really fantastic. And I just want to say thank you to everybody who's been supporting the podcast, who's been tweeting about it and putting it on their social media, sending links to friends, and simply just telling people about it. That's the best way to spread the word about this podcast. And me and Christoph, of course, will be coming back to you very soon, in just about 2 weeks, with another episode. And definitely stay tuned. I've got some really interesting episodes for Porkins Policy Radio that we're going to be doing in the next few weeks. We're going to be taking a look at Jim Jones and the People's Temple, and I think we're also going to be doing a whole episode on Scientology. So that should be really interesting. We've got some other great guests lined up for the future. So thank you all for listening, and I will be talking to you very soon.